I would think your strategy ought to be to disclose as much as possible to people who professionally need to know about it.
I completely agree with that. I almost think you'd scare the public if you put this out. Like, why are they telling me this? Should I be concerned about my bank? I think you've got to think of the unintended consequences of taking a public that has more full faith and confidence in the banking system than maybe people in this room do, that we want them to have full faith and confidence in the banking system. They know the FDIC insurance is there. They know it works. They put their money in. They're going to get their money out. So there's a select crowd of people that are in the institutional side. And if they want to understand this, they're going to find a way to understand this. There's a bunch of law firms represented in this room. There's a bunch of people that'll charge them by the hour a lot of money to explain this all to them. And it's fine. I don't have a problem with that. And they all have huge staffs. But I would be careful about the unintended consequences of starting to blast too much of this out in the general public.
We're also wondering if we need to be more transparent about some of the accountability mechanisms that we have as well for the general public audience. You know, we are required to remove culpable management. How would we go about doing that? Do we need to re-emphasize that in the Dodd-Frank hierarchy that compensation claims are subordinated to general creditors and that prior compensation could even be clawed back if it did? And then finally, there's the funding mechanism. What part of that would be most helpful to boost confidence? I do think that the OLF and using it as the big gift, it's not a gift, but the big tool that we need in Title II to help provide confidence. But what do people need to know to really get that? How important is it to explain the rules and the mechanics for the OLF? How money will get from point A to point B. How would we use targeted guarantees to allay concerns about excess cash use? There's a lot of questions here.
I guess I am a bit pessimistic about your ability to communicate with the people who really need to know in terms of a crisis. And this is partly from my experience of teaching this stuff. There was a lot of interest just after the crisis. It's dwindled over time. And so people are sort of less and less interested in getting into the nitty-gritty and some of the really interesting developments. So I would think your strategy ought to be to disclose as much as possible to people who professionally need to know about it. And that would certainly include the ratings agencies and the people within the banks who are responsible for these judgments. And simply have publicly available a place where people can go if they need to know more. Because we're dealing with a society where people are getting their information in tweets. There's just no patience, I think, for going through the elaborate and careful planning that has gone on. It should be there. It should be accessible when people need to know. But I don't think you have much hope of reaching a public that doesn't have a professional need to know.
I completely agree with that. I almost think you'd scare the public if you put this out. Like, why are they telling me this? Should I be concerned about my bank? Like, my insurance company doesn't tell me what they're doing with my assets. They just assume they're going to pay my claim, right? I think you've got to think of the unintended consequences of taking a public that has more full faith and confidence in the banking system than maybe people in this room do, that we want them to have full faith and confidence in the banking system. They know the FDIC insurance is there. They know it works. They put their money in. They're going to get their money out. So there's a select crowd of people that are in the institutional side. And if they want to understand this, they're going to find a way to understand this. There's a bunch of law firms represented in this room. There's a bunch of people that'll charge them by the hour a lot of money to explain this all to them. And it's fine. I don't have a problem with that. And they all have huge staffs. But I would be careful about the unintended consequences of starting to blast too much of this out in the general public.
So I'd like to take a slightly different view, maybe a middle ground in the center. First of all, I think, Susan and Betsy, what you've done and the thoughtfulness here is extraordinary, and I want to give you respect for it. I do think there's more that could be put out in the public, perhaps not just on Title II, but also on Title I, in a way that isn't scary to folks. I mean, Gary, there's a timing question, right? We're we're at a delicate moment now. So if it goes out tomorrow, it might have a different impact than if it, if Susan and Betsy do their work and it goes out as we're moving out of the recession.
I think this is an incredibly important point. And you see it, any statement that's made, whether it's made by a regulator or an institution, is going to be tested by the market.
Peacetime.
And we have to understand that. And I think that just putting the 2 points together, what you want to have out there today is something that when you make a statement in a time of stress, it provides that underpinning for the statement. And I think that's the way to think about the body of work that you have out there. And it's kind of a dynamic relationship for when you have to make a stabilizing statement.
I wondered whether there are some market tests of whether you're being heard. And I think about TLAC. So TLAC should respond to good and bad news about the institutions. And it's really important. I mean, it's a little bit conflicted, right? I mean, it's important that people understand they can be bailed in, but you don't want a huge run on the institution. But they're going to be. And it could be an early warning signal to the FDIC and the primary regulators when these things happen. And there may be some other prices. This is similar to what Jay was saying in the market that you can tell whether people understand who's going to be protected, who isn't going to be protected. It would be, I think, an interesting study to look at the evolution of market prices in a situation like March of 2020, for example, and see whether people understood what might happen.
I might go further than that, Don, because I think that you look at the evolution, I think we have to sit down and talk to long-term debt investors and make sure that they, as a stakeholder group, fully understand bank debt today is not what it was before. It is not principal protected by design. And I think that that expectation, I like how you started off, Betsy, like it's all about expectation setting. And I think that is absolutely critical. If that doesn't hold, this whole thing doesn't hold. And so I think it's one area to focus on. I do want to go back to something Jay said about stabilizing statements. In my experience, they're not stabilizing. If you have to make a stabilizing statement, you're in real trouble. And I think that part of that means that there's a lot of pre-work that needs to be done such that those statements aren't seen as a reach. Because if they're seen as a reach, the market sniffs that out in 2 seconds and actually has the opposite impact. And this is one of those big challenges, like what can be done ahead of time so that it's all going as planned, hands off the wheel. This is part of what we've been prepared for, because that's what builds confidence.
You just said very well what I was trying to say.
So I think the most stabilizing comments have not been coming from the FDIC. They've been coming after the CCAR tests. And so there's been a consistent approach now for over 10 years of pronouncements coming out about the banks, about how much capital they're able to return, how much stock they can buy back, what kind of dividends they can pay. And that consistency, the market understands that. Even the common public will understand that. They know how to read those headlines. I think what we talked about here with the FDIC's role of having this available for institutions, have it available somewhere. The professional markets understand it. But I think right now the more stabilizing factor is that we've had 10 plus years of reports on stress testing, on capital levels, on dividend levels, et cetera. And maybe we should think more about, is there a way to make that more transparent or eliminate some of the jargon, et cetera. But what you're doing, I think, is excellent work, but maybe should be more for professional investors and available to anybody.